Welcome everybody, this is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors.
And this is Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors Group.
We'd like to welcome you to our K-12 Politics and Tech video series.
Our objective is to give you the absolute latest of what's going on in Sacramento that affects public school districts, obviously, and as well as all the technology stuff that's going on that's so vital to delivering for kids these days.
And remember, if you find these videos useful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share out over social media. You're our marketing team. We appreciate your support, and let's go ahead and get started.
Welcome everybody, Tim Watrous back with another episode of K-12 Politics and Tech. I'm the President of Digital Advisors. As always, we have Kevin Gordon, co-host of the show, President of Capital Advisors. Kevin, glad you're here.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, and as always, we have plenty of news for you. Let's start in California. The governor has actually been pretty active meeting with K-12 leaders. Can you talk a little bit about what the governor's been up to?
Yeah, so what we're expecting out of the governor, he had a meeting with some superintendents that was more of a small group meeting. Earlier this week, he is going to be speaking to AXA's Superintendent Symposium today. And so what we're anticipating is for him to talk more about some flexibility that the administration, I think, is going to be giving schools on the newest guidance issued by the California Department of Public Health. All these issues about reopening. The governor's had, not a good couple of weeks in terms of the rollout of his proposal of a $2 billion plan for reopening. It's been sort of a rocky reception over at the state capitol building. That combined with, at the same time while he was doing it, California Department of Public Health issued guidelines that would be mandatory for school agencies up and down the state, layered on top of the idea of this proposal and people taking money. Lots of confusion between what rules apply to which. Rules that apply if you're taking the money, what rules apply if you're not. And it's just really not sort of the best in terms of coordination on those issues. So the governor's showing some flexibility. He talks about wanting to inject the concept of a state level adjudication is what they're calling it. I don't know why they have to use such big words. Bottom line is they want to have some flexibility that takes into account what's going on in individual school districts with regard to, containment, safety measures, what's transmission looking like, and that to the extent that individual districts are doing the right things and they don't need a whole lot more intervention, I think there's going to be flexibility in those cases is what they're getting at. So look for the governor's overall action this week to try to provide more flexibility to school agencies relative to all of this guidance and the rules.
Well, we know a lot of our superintendent friends are in a tricky spot between our friends in labor and the community's hope to get students back in school as soon as possible. So it's nice that the governor's in there actually having some communication with superintendents on this, and hopefully we'll see some good news come out of the state that everybody agrees to soon enough. So thanks for sharing that, Kevin. Also in DC right now, there's some significant dollars coming out of DC to help basically get the world moving again. Can you talk about some of those dollars that we're seeing coming out this week?
Yeah, major announcement here at the end of the week from Bobby Scott, who's the chairman in the House of Representatives of the Education and Labor Committee. Scott is announcing a package of 3 bills that amount to almost $500 billion. And some of them, extend over a longer period of time. But of those pieces, we've got this big giant piece that's $266 billion or $261 billion. Now, that investment is over a 10-year period, and the objective is to stem any kind of layoffs of teachers because of sort of downward impacts in individual states with regard to budget cuts to education. Now, we would presumably get some of that money too. And the idea is to just make sure that local school agency budgets are bolstered enough so that they don't have to go to a place where you would be laying off school employees. So it's an idea that's not new. We actually heard it earlier in the year, but with a Republican administration and Republican US Senate, it was more of a sort of planting a flag on where House members stood. I don't think they really thought they could get it passed. Now this is really serious legislation that could go somewhere. So you combine that with another part of the stimulus, which is aimed at what we call infrastructure. And I know you have a lot of thoughts about this, Tim, of smart buildings, but it's $130 billion, $100 billion for infrastructure, $30 billion for bond capacity for LEAs all across the country. That is going to be aimed at all of the issues we've heard a lot about with regard to ventilation, HVAC, the kind of improvements that you need to make in your schools to make them safe and also make them places that are going to work more efficiently in delivering education for kids.
Well, thanks, Kevin. I just want to reiterate, a few weeks ago, we had talked about some reports what the top 3 things that CTOs were going to be working on this year. And one of the top 3 things was building automation. So when you say smart buildings, we're talking about connecting things like lights, the HVAC system, security cameras, doors and locks, who's going to be where and when, automating all these processes within the buildings. If you're going to go in and make some upgrades, make sure you're thinking about all those types of systems and how they connect to that one common infrastructure. Because when you do it one time, you think through all the cabling issues, you're going to save a lot of dollars addressing all those systems at once rather than treating them as separate projects. So that smart buildings thing is a very worthwhile way to spend your time. Make sure you're supporting your tech teams and your facilities teams in that endeavor, especially with these dollars coming down from the federal government. So thanks for sharing that, Kevin. Additional pot of dollars aimed at some learning loss. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so then that package also has an additional $75 billion that will be provided over 2 years. This also would have a distribution that's exactly like what we see in ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, which is Title I formula. So you see Title I distribution for this particular purpose. California would get, easily 10% of that, if not a little bit more. So over $7 billion of aid that would come. And we're really kind of on the cutting edge of that. And this goes back to the adoption of the state budget last summer. You'll remember that with the leadership of Linda Darling-Hammond, the president of the State Board of Education and a top education advisor to the governor, and you looked at what the governor wanted to do, they packaged up last spring all 4 pots. One of them was a state pot, 3 pots of federal money combined to call it the Learning Loss Mitigation Fund. And so we sort of already ahead of that curve a little bit. This adds more resources to that. But in addition to it, and you'd made the observation in our conversation before we went on the air here about the $4.6 billion that the state is also got in its proposed budget for the same ideas, which is this is the idea of extended learning, summer school, after school programs, interventions that take place to try to mitigate the learning loss that we know is out there.
Yeah, and Kevin, like we said, there's a lot of similarities between what we're seeing come from DC and what we've seen the governor propose in his recent budget proposal in January. And I don't think that's any mistake. You'd mentioned that Linda Darling-Hammond's probably got something to do with that. Certain former senator, now vice president, Kamala Harris probably has something to do with that as well. But it is nice to see that synergy between the federal and state, and that means that we may have some additional dollars to boost what the governor's trying to do here as well.
Yeah.
I think, just the other thing to think about on that learning loss side, when you're starting to think about after-school programs, summer school programs, we also mentioned a couple of weeks ago the impact that tutoring has in reducing the learning loss and reducing that gap. Right. So if you're thinking about, online tutors, how to get kids access to that, that's a very important thing to be thinking about adding to your arsenal of tools to battle learning loss. And, there's some more things that I think are trends that are helping kids stay engaged. I think there was a little bit of resistance to esports originally. We're starting to see a lot more adoption all the way down to the elementary grades. I think people are open to kids sort of getting rewarded or just having the ability to have some fun, if you will, and collaborate with each other using that platform. And, I just think that is something that has been a trend, but we're going to see that continue to rise. And if you saw anything about GameStop this week, one of the top performing stocks, this is something that can actually help kids stay engaged. And there are some elements of learning. And, just keep that in mind as you're kind of looking around, thinking about some of those dollars and how to spend. I would definitely consider at least investigating that a little bit more. So with that, Kevin, you talked about before the show, we talked about a PACE study that came out with those core districts in California. Can you walk us through some of the data that they just presented to folks in this capacity?
Yeah, and it's certainly intuitive. we're all talking about it, so we know it's there. Now we've got some data that backs it up. So I think districts all across California, district leaders across the state have become familiar with the core collaborative. We call it the Core Data Collaborative, and it's a lot of some of the major urban districts, but we've got there's a couple of districts also in the Central Valley, a little bit smaller, but mostly some of the major districts with big enrollments across the state who collaborate to compare data and look at trends that will inform key issues that we're grappling with in education. And so they looked real deeply with PACE, and people are familiar with PACE, put out this report, and we'll have a link to that here on the email that we send out with this broadcast to this report that validates the very pervasive learning loss that we're finding all across the state as a result of what's been going on, obviously during the entire pandemic that we've been suffering. So data that matches that, money and proposals that try to address the issue. I think sort of it's all hands on deck to try to deal with this issue. You're going to find that report to be really informative.
Thanks, Kevin. I just want to also point out the fact that that core group of districts, these are some of the largest, most urban districts in the state: San Francisco, Long Beach, LA, and many others. There are some Central Valley districts represented there as well. But this is not just a problem in rural districts where connectivity is a major challenge. These are big cities having major issues getting connected to students and families, and it could be for any number of reasons. But this is not just a rural issue. It's both urban and rural, and it's widespread. So thanks for sharing that with us. Just speaking of learning loss, we've been just touching on that for the last couple of points. There was a major outage on the East Coast this week. There was a internet cable was cut in Brooklyn, which basically brought down things like Gmail, Zoom, and Slack on the East Coast for an entire day. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, we used to talk about major outages all the time. Have you had the time to think about your plan B? Because your connection to your teacher's connection to their students can make or break a day or multiple days of interaction between students and the school. And if you don't, now's the time to start thinking, what is your plan B? Do you have a plan B application if plan A is down? Do you have a plan B way to connect to the internet if plan A is down? Certainly for you, your colleagues, your staff, and perhaps for your students if you're fortunate enough to be able to think in that way. But there are outages. Outages are a real thing in today's world, and learning loss is a big issue. So when you get some time to think about having, we always say single point of failure in technology is dangerous. Have that backup plan ready to go as often as you can to avoid those learning loss moments. And Kevin, I think the other thing you'd mentioned before we jumped on was, the CDC has finally chimed in with some reopening guidance. Can you talk a little about what the CDC put out this week?
Yeah, so there's this major CDC study that validates with data what again has been, talked about now for a couple of months, which is this incredibly low level of transmission amongst school-age students, as well as low levels of risk of contracting the virus amongst school-age students. And so it just validates that. It puts more pressure on people like the governor. It validates the president's call for reopening schools within the 100 days. But boy, it's interesting because it runs, headlong into trouble relative to the disposition of our friends in labor, some of the major teacher unions in the country, and also the California Teachers Association, who've got a little bit different view about, what the data says and what it means to have safe schools. And totally get it. So the other thing that you'll notice on our agenda today was the letter by the California Teachers Association, which I have here. And we can actually provide a link to that too, so people can read it. I actually think the letter is an amazingly, really thoughtful letter about a lot of the issues that teachers are struggling with. But the upshot is in direct conflict with those that want to try to get to reopen before we end the school year. I think you can't come away after reading it without a conclusion, given how quickly we're going to get vaccines out, that their position is probably not to see reopening this school year for in-person instruction. Certainly, having everybody in. There's a line I just wanted to read to you. It says in the letter, it says, what we can do is move toward in-person opening in a deliberate way when it's safe, because we have done the hard work to get there by limiting community spread and because we have distributed a vaccine. They say the virus is in charge right now and it does not own a calendar. We cannot just pick an artificial calendar date and expect to flip a switch on reopening every school for in-person instruction. And what they're trying to get at are these, political agendas that want to set up artificial dates to say, let's all get back and start opening again. And so pretty pointed message there from the teachers. We can't open schools if we don't have our teachers and our classified staff there. So at some point, these things have to come together. The data and sort of political speak about getting reopened, the urgency that we have from parents and others want us to reopen, but the reality that we haven't done the things that we need to do to obviously convince our employees that they need to come back. Somewhere in there is got to be that answer.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Kevin. And yeah, I mean, we've been seeing reopening guidance since the pandemic started. And it feels like we're actually getting to a place where we're having more substantive conversations. There's more dollars being discussed and more negotiating, if you will. So I think it feels to me like we're having more productive conversations and therefore hopefully getting closer to that actual reopening. So we'll keep our fingers crossed on that we can all return safely soon. So just one final thing here is we've talked about the FCC many times. We're very excited that I think that there's hope to maybe upgrade the E-rate program. Also this week back in the news is the net neutrality debate. As we all rely on the internet more to do our jobs and to communicate with our family and loved ones and to educate our children, a free and open internet, I believe, is very important. I would ask everybody to spend a little bit of time on this issue. And if you haven't yet, CITE has led the charge about net neutrality. Our good friends at CITE, they're very, strong proponents of a free and open internet. And I believe this is something that you want to spend a little bit of time on, learn a little bit more about, because this is a debate that is going to be very important for us moving forward. So please take a few moments, learn a little bit about net neutrality. We'll put a link in the article, underneath the YouTube, and then out to the clients as well this week. But I think it's definitely worth paying attention to. And keep in mind, we're also looking for that help from the FCC in regards to modernizing E-rate. That was in several versions of stimulus. It never made it through. Now we've got that democratically controlled FCC, and we're hearing a lot of whispers that that's about to drop and actually have a nice big impact on some federal dollars that will help you address distance learning. So with that, Kevin, any final thoughts before we wrap up here?
Well, one of the things I did wanted to kind of follow up on is sort of what the synthesis of the net neutrality issue is really about control and efforts to try to charge more for some users than others. And then those users that pay more get more readily accessible access to the internet, and at the expense of schools. And the idea that now is you basically saying, look, everybody has equal access rather than disparities based on what people pay. Isn't that really what it is?
Yeah, I mean, there's basically, if you think about it in terms of something that you're probably familiar with, if you're on AT&T, they might give you an application like HBO Max at no cost. But if you're on Verizon, you would therefore have to pay. So you could say that's AT&T and HBO creating an unfair advantage on one side of the internet for a particular application.
Right.
And you think about things like that, like Netflix, YouTube, things you might learn with. If we're giving priority on the internet to applications because it's going to make an organization more money, that's not necessarily the free and open internet that folks might hope for. And I think those are the types of things that our friends at CITE are concerned about, right? Just basically everybody having freely available internet access, the best that they can afford, and then not having to worry about applications being throttled because of the interests of organizations. And, we've seen this debate sort of swing back and forth. There's a lot of debate right now in the news, but this is basically, if we start to think about internet as a utility, right? Everyone needs water, everyone needs, clean air, everyone needs electricity, and we think that everyone needs internet. We need to treat it the same way, and we wouldn't throttle someone's water in a particular area because of a financial interest. Well, Kevin, I just want to check in with you. Does that explanation make sense about the net neutrality? Does that clear things up a little bit?
Yeah, and I think
Okay.
it's really good for us to try to make sure, we synthesize this so that we can, in fact, get, rank and file education leaders behind us in this overall effort. So great, very, very good analogies. So
Thanks, Kevin. And yeah, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for tuning in again this week. If you haven't yet, please go ahead and share us out on social media. Like the video on YouTube, that'll certainly help us. Let your friends know about the show, and we do appreciate you checking in. So, Kevin, wonderful chatting with you. We'll chat with you next week.
great. We'll see you, everybody. So thanks again for joining us for another week of this broadcast.
And I just want to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and share this out over social media. Again, you're our marketing team. I'll also finish by saying, if you have some questions, please send them our way. We'd be happy to address them on a future broadcast. So with that, thanks everybody, and we'll talk soon.